Atlas Pandemica, Maps to a Kinder World, is a project by the Stove Network designed to encourage pioneering approaches in charting the changes that have happened since the outbreak of COVID-19 locally, and tries to navigate the way forward into a more hopeful and shared future. In this series, Stove orchestrator Matt Baker speaks with the artists, writers and researchers involved in the project, offering an insight into the process and discoveries each have made. We hope you enjoy.
Welcome to Atlas Pandemica podcast number 5. I'm Matt Baker, and along with artist Robbie Coleman, I'm one of the curators of the project. Atlas Pandemica Maps to a Kinder World is a compendium of 10 projects led by creative people, each investigating a different theme highlighted by life during the COVID pandemic. Projects work directly with people in Dumfries and Galloway, focusing on the impacts and the learning from the community's experience of the evolving pandemic. Atlas Pandemica was conceived and is managed by community-led arts organisation the Stove Network. It explores local responses to the pandemic and how these might shape new approaches to our shared future. The project is supported by Scottish Government's Supporting Communities Fund. You can find more information at atlaspandemica.org. In this podcast series, I'll be talking to each of the artists leading one of the Atlas explorations. And today, it's a huge pleasure to be joined by JoAnne McKay. JoAnne is a poet, writer and researcher who's lived in Dumfries and Galloway for over 20 years. Originally from Essex, her first career was as a police officer, and on moving to Scotland, she worked for the national charity Arthritis Care, managing services for children and young adults. She combines her writing with working for Dumfries museums. Hello and welcome, JoAnne. How are you doing?
Thank you very much, Matt. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and to be speaking to you.
Of course it is.
Yes.
Okay. Let's fire in. So from the start, then can you tell me a bit about what attracted you to the project and what was happening for you during the pandemic when the invitation to be involved was advertised?
Well, it was the strangest March, wasn't it? We were enduring that absolutely beautiful weather, the bizarreness of what we were reading about in Wuhan and Italy. The lockdown was announced, and I should have gone back to work on April the 1st at Dumfries museums, and that was a non-starter. So I genuinely think it was the Stove's actual homegrown project that started this process of reflection for me, because I had 2 sons at home that couldn't get to school, the concern over a husband working in the ambulance service and the inadequateness of PPE. And then all of a sudden we started doing mad things like making memory jars and practicing inoscopes and suddenly responding to the pandemic in a creative fashion became, an actual way of processing things that were going on. So I think I was in the zone when the commission opportunities for Atlas Pandemica came out. And of course I read it and I just thought that is, because I was starting to get very infuriated with this constant use of the word unprecedented. Everyone was saying it's unprecedented. It's an unprecedented, and it is the most unprecedented event because we have a World Health Organization because of global pandemics. We have pandemic preparedness plans in every major government because we have previous pandemics. And Dumfries and Galloway has endured, survived and thrived after so many previous pandemics, and yet everyone was going, this has never happened in the world before. And so I thought to actually be able to get the opportunity to research, look at, obviously the cholera, Spanish flu was, the greatest pandemic this world's ever seen. And nobody remembers it, nobody knows anything about it. So to be able to go, I'm really going to be able to have a really deep look at that and then think about it and respond to it. And obviously the greatest thing about, doing any project is then being able to share it with other people in some crazy creative fashion, was just fantastic. So it was that strange weirdness of not having a job and doing loads and loads of creative stuff with my sons, and thinking, no, I could really do this, because I'm not much of a commission applier, but something so chimed with me. I thought I just have to do this. So hence I applied. And luckily, you're obviously convinced enough by my plan that you took me on and commissioned me, which was absolutely wonderful. And it's been a process of exploration that's been going on now for a good 15 months, I think. So fantastic. So that was what happened. It was a strange time.
Yeah, it was. Well, your interview was one of those wonderful moments in this kind of commissioning process where you're just hearing somebody basically reading the project idea back to you of like, no, JoAnne's like totally got it. It was just lovely. And I mean, let's get into the history thing. I mean, your project's called What Remains, and you've described it as a lovely phrase, a plumb line to the now. I mean, what is it about history that made you want to use that as a way of looking at the pandemic?
Well, I think because the past is there to read, to learn from, and to reflect on present situations from. And I think Dumfries and Galloway, so the whole region, our history is so present in our geography, in our architecture, in our town layouts. We have stayed remarkably similar, really, since probably the Enclosure Act. And so history is there staring at us on the streets. And if you can access, the stories that the past is telling us about how people have lived in the past, how people have dealt with things in the past, then it gives you a really, just a really strong ability to actually process current events and think, what can we take from the past and what can we use new technologies and new techniques to change, adapt, and move forward. So it's not studying the past for the past's sake, but it's actually saying, there are lessons to be learned here, and we can change the way we do certain things because things have moved on, technology's moved on. So it's always that double gift that the past gives us. And I think we ignore it at our peril when it's there to use, and in particular in this region, it is so accessible to us.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by that idea. You're saying it's staring you in the face, but it's not staring most people in the face, is it? I mean, because people don't see, because so used to it, you don't see it. I mean, and then you say ignore it at our peril.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating, because very few towns and indeed cities have cholera mounds surviving. We have, the 1832 cholera mound slap bang in the middle of our greatest parish church, St Michael's, with fantastic inscribed, huge sandstone slab. And yet, as you say, obviously I've been up there quite a lot during the research of pandemics, and you still meet people that go, I didn't know that was there, etc. So, again, possibly a key part of the project, although it's a job for everybody in Dumfries and Galloway, it is making these monuments in our region really real and relevant for people again, and that would be a lovely outcome from some of what we're doing. And I think ignoring it, that sounds very ominous, doesn't it? And very sententious. But sometimes we tend to struggle with dealing with difficult situations. And, we listen to governments, explaining why they're doing things that they're doing, how they're responding to certain things. And yet, people exactly like us, nothing has changed about the nature of humanity since humanity first started civilizing. People like us have lived through this before. Societies have fought injustices. Injustices have been wrought upon societies. And these things mark the past and the society we live in at present, beautifully encapsulated with the whole Black Lives Matter movement, which, again, I think generated by the febrileness of the times throughout the world. And all of a sudden, somebody goes, oh, yes, but look at our colonial past. Does this not play a really major role in the way so many Black people feel completely alienated from society, and and the fact that they're not equal, they don't feel equal. And so you look at the past and you think, oh look, every single major Georgian house in the whole of the country is actually based on slavery, and as if that's a revelation. Well, of course it's not, but that history has not been promoted or taught to us. And, it's the same with the history of medicine and pandemics. There is so much in the past that we have done. Previous peoples didn't treat them as some huge mystery. Everyone loves to say, oh, it was God or it was the miasma. But, even back in the 1400s and 1500s, they were still isolating people. They were still cleaning premises to make sure that that disease didn't escape from that house. And we act as if somehow a lockdown is a huge surprise when it's a technique that's been used before. Quarantine's an absolute gift from the past, because we had maritime quarantine in Britain and every single British colony from about 1650, and we were really bad at it, because we're a mercantile trading nation. So every businessman said to the government and said to the reigning monarch, oh no, we can't have this because we can't get our goods in quick enough. And exactly the same things happened with any talk about stopping airlines or quarantine situations that we're going through now, because every single commercial company, airline and operator is saying you can't do that because you'll wreck the economy. And, it's been experienced before. And if we look at, those tensions from 1650s, 1700s, 1800s, we could form a more informed response to how, governments actually respond to lockdown today and quarantining today. And, the example is obviously Jacinda Ardern, who had, some serious self-belief to say, my country is shutting down, and we will, drive the economy from interior trade and not from external. But, that's such a bold move to take, and yet, arguably, has been one of the most successful approaches to the pandemic. But in Britain, of course, we go, well, no, we're a really busy mercantile nation and we need to get people in for business, etc. And what have we ended up with? One of the worst death tolls in Europe. So history, it's all happened before. We're really, really bad at quarantine. We were really bad at quarantine in the 1700s because everyone was saying, I must get my goods in. I can't have it lay over for 40 days. So it's all there. So that's why history paints this absolutely present picture to what is, this extraordinary situation. And it is extraordinary, but don't think that people haven't faced these questions before, because they have done.
Amazing. Okay, so you set out to research local cholera outbreaks in the 19th century and the Spanish flu pandemic of the early 20th century. So what did you do? How did you do it?
Well, again, just so bizarre. Anyone that wants to research in Dumfries and Galloway, we have one port of call, and that is the Ewart Library, because the Ewart's got the local archives, which are phenomenal, some of the best local archives genuinely in the UK, I think. And of course, the Ewart was shut, so we couldn't get in there to research. So you do what everybody else does, is you get on the internet. And the Dumfries and Galloway standard, luckily, has been very largely digitised. And although you have to have a kind of pay site, you can get in through Find My Past or Ancestry.com, etc., which is a gift and a half. you buy an awful lot of books, which can sometimes be much more disappointing than you think. I think probably the toughest one, Matt, was the Spanish flu, because it's been really only in probably the past 10, 15 years that people have started to reignite interest in this really significant pandemic. And the academic writings and popular books have started about it, and I couldn't find very much relevant to Dumfries and Galloway. So I really had to sort of trawl through the newspapers that I could access for that. And I think it was my inability to find as much about Spanish flu that made me then take that step back to the plague, and the realization that plague's actually was a pandemic and then endemic in Scotland right up to the mid 1600s, was what took me back to there. So it's been tough, and I'm going to have to share, and I got this book especially for this interview. So there is a classic work on the Black Death by Philip Ziegler that a lot of people probably have heard of, but to huge fanfare, a new, really scholarly, described as a magisterial study into the Black Death was produced by Ole Benedictau. Huge book, really scholarly. So I bought this with a huge anticipation, thinking this is going to be telling me exactly what I need to know. Looked up Scotland in the index, and on page 145 of a 400-page book, this is the paragraph: "There is such a severe paucity of source material for the history of the Black Death in Scotland that it is virtually impossible to discuss the matter at all. Southern parts of Scotland were apparently invaded by the Black Death in the second half of 1349, but 1350 was the year when most of Scotland was affected." Full stop. So a man has written a 400-page book, inserts a sentence to say, no, there's nothing on Scotland. And of course, it's not true. There's loads of stuff on Scotland, because chroniclers, particularly in abbeys, who were the people that were writing in those days, were writing about Scotland. And indeed, some of it is the most lively, wonderful writing on pandemics and living through pandemics that you can actually find. So books, internet, and then obviously the physicality of the region. So when we were allowed to travel, it was the getting out and about, obviously the graveyards, because the layout of Dumfries is remarkably similar, particularly to how it was during the cholera pandemic. You can walk streets where the doctors lived and the districts that they were given to look after. The hospitals, some now repurposed, are still there, and actually being able to travel. One of the most moving things was going down to Carspow, which was where the quarantine station was for the Solway, and following just the inlet round, and seeing a defunct, decayed sort of pier structure stood where there was really significant quarantine station, was just incredible. And so I think as a region, we offer so much to anybody that really wants to dig down into what's happened in the region in the past, and obviously speak to the museum a lot, speak to the council archaeologist as well. So there are sources out there, but it required possibly more creativity in some ways than having the ability to do what everyone would normally do, which was walk into the Ewart and just start trawling through the archives.
Well, let's talk about that creativity bit, because you were doing this research, you were projecting yourself back and inhabiting that world, but you were also making things from this research as a part of the process, which, because I really remember a really early conversation with you where you were talking about a sort of date stamping what you're doing, of like, you were consciously making stuff for the archives for 100, 200 years. You were doing that very self-consciously and talking about making paper that had the DNA of now, so that you could literally, analyze that paper. So yeah, talk us through some of the things that you were doing. I mean, I remember plague masks, and there's a whole thing about the oak trees, and I mean, yeah. Well, you weren't just looking in books.
Again, it became, a facet of actually working through this, in that, there was a period when we couldn't travel, and that was, we genuinely had a lockdown. And I'm not a great nature, I'm not a great nature lover. I don't respond unduly to nature, and certainly never did beforehand. But I was pressed by circumstance to walk within, a 3-mile radius of my house in Pempan. And of course, you're mulling on all this stuff as you're walking. All of a sudden, you notice that we have really significantly old oak trees around here, and particularly on Cape Nook Estate, which is very nearby. And of course, then you start thinking, how long has that been stood here? It has been present for every pandemic I'm looking at. And so you start to think, how can I incorporate this solidity, this continuity of, living being within what I'm trying to do? And then you think this year, which was 2020, is a year of history. It's a year of world history. How do I create things which become intimately and only 2020? So it involved a lot of measuring oaks and finding the ones which did actually start growing before 1349, which was the first outbreak of Black Death. But the paper making was just fantastic, because, and I think it must tie back obviously to some police this in the past, and forensic examination. And then of course you start thinking about forensic archaeology and forensic botany. And of course everything has a stamp of not only the time, but also your region, because pollens, isotopes, etc. exist in vegetation that can only be from this place at this time. So I decided I was going to make paper. So for the hot months of the year, because it takes quite a long time to dry. Of course, I was making paper from everything that was growing, fruiting, etc., and turning that into material which could then be used for transmitting, my normal medium, which is words itself, onto. But the paper has very much become an artifact in itself, and it can only be 2020 paper from a very particular part of Dumfries and Galloway during this extraordinary year, and to be able to create a minutiae of a global event is I think really critical. And of course you just think this will become history for future generations, not my work necessarily, but very specific things. The plague mask was a gift and a half, because, and of course there's so many stories around that now. Of course I just thought, when I very first started thinking plague masks, and then that what has now become iconic, sign language that Dumfries and Galloway Council were using about on all the public spaces about, keep your distance, etc., in very strong colour tones. And so we created a plague mask which had the Dumfries and Galloway social distancing signage on. Well, of course, that then morphs into, let's film the plague doctor at various important pandemic places in the region. So I did a lot of filming last year with my son. And of course, this year, doesn't the plague doctor scaring children stories start with Nithsdale Police, etc., etc.? So we are probably the only contributor to Atlas Pandemica that have been contacted by the police to be asked, was that you? Because there's been obviously, and again, how utterly 2020, 2021, that there becomes a social media, story about plague doctors scaring children. And how much more relevant can Plague Doctor then become for this pandemic? It's absolutely, fabulous current history response and, people's response to heard stories. So yeah, that's glorious, absolutely glorious.
So,
but no, we won't do it any time in 2021.
No, it's fact, and the pictures from all of that are just fabulous. Please go look at them on JoAnne's page on the website.
There's many more, Matt. I think obviously one of our real ultimate aims is to get this and again, it was an experience with the stove and making the Perseverance film for the Dog Girl. It's to get this into a series of moving images, but it's exceedingly dependent from my artistic wishes to get the right words to overlay the visuals. So we've got some really, really lovely visuals, but I've got to find a narrative to bring it together in my head. But I think I'm getting there. So.
That's usually the wrong way around, isn't it? You normally start with the words.
To be honest with you, Matt, again, it's been this whole process, and I mean, really been living it in so many ways. This whole process has made me approach things differently and think differently. And of course, we've got to, address what is an elephant in the room for all poets, is that, even albeit the current, popularity of spoken word and increasing interest in poetry is not like your go-to medium for mass communication. Very, very few people actually walk out the house and go, I must go and buy myself a poetry book today. It's not. It's not the biggest seller, and no poet is rich. And so part of that, and part of this absolute desire to communicate the glories of what we've got from, the stuff that I've been finding, is how do I communicate it in other ways? And sculptural is, really powerful and effective. And pictorial. I wanted a map drawn of Cape Nook and the Oaks because they became so central to the process. So not being an artist myself, I was able to approach an artist thanks to the commission and ask them to create, a map of where the Oaks were situated, and then intersperse that with my own text and details of previous pandemics, and that single very large map brings together so many aspects of Dumfries and Galloway, but is interesting not just for text but for visual beauty. So it's been a huge learning process for me. It's been brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
And do you think has it changed anything about the way that you're looking at history now as well, having gone through that creative process of like actually making, you've literally been making history, haven't you, really, I suppose?
I think, like everything, Matt, I think I'm a slow percolator. So things, I obviously work at the speed of history. in the things take a while for my head to, process, reflect, live. And then it could be 6 months later, all of a sudden you see an image, you hear a phrase, you're engaged in some activity, and all of a sudden everything you've processed about what you've previously read, experienced, etc., comes back. So I think undoubtedly it's made me far more experimental in the way I'm willing to approach communication with what our audience is at the end of the day. And I think I'll probably be more willing to experiment in future. And that's a huge positive for me. It really is. It's moved me in directions that I wouldn't have normally, because I'm very, very happy with a small piece of paper sat in a dark room and writing to myself.
Let's get into the writing bit then. I mean, from your perspective and from others, because you've talked to me about the difficulty that you see that people are experiencing articulating feelings about the current pandemic, and that a number of writers have felt blocked because it's just too much to.
Yeah.
Can you say a bit more about that and your experience of working with some, because I know you work with a couple of local writing groups during your research, yeah?
Well, there's a fantastic technique called blackout poetry, and it was a suspicion, Matt. It wasn't an absolute. I thought sometimes things are so big and so present and so current that you cannot find the words to even begin writing. And the joy of blackout poetry is you work with existing text. So it could be a newspaper page, it could be, a notice, a section from a magazine, a previous, book, etc. And then you eliminate from that section of text the words you don't want and leave the words that you do want. And so I thought it may be a way in for people to actually read other people's reflections on enduring pandemics, living through pandemics, the strictures that were surrounding previous pandemics, and see whether anything chimed with them. Obviously, my hope was that something would chime with them about current experiences, and that they would then be able to create it's a very free way of actually working in order to make something that was utterly theirs, but using the words of the past. And so I had just a brilliant workshop with one of the writing groups, and it was on Zoom, but I posted out the previous the text that I would like them to look at, a lot of which were documents that are in Dumfries museums, copies of documents in Dumfries Museum. And it was that strange combination of recognition and yet joy of making, so that you come up with a final text which is utterly yours, it's utterly your response, but you haven't had to drag your soul in order to produce it. So it was highly effective, although regarding the way you phrased the question, I think writers have been blocked, but a lot of people have been writing very, very successfully as well. So it's been tremendously interesting to me to read a lot of people's ongoing writing about their experience of pandemic, and thinking how very, very effective and insightful it has been. So it's not a truism that every writer's got, oh God, no, I can't write, it's too big, because some people are writing really effectively. But I thought this technique was a really interesting way to come into writing. And then we did one workshop on the plague, which was just a dream, because so much of the Scottish writing on the plague is just so funny. And of course, it being slightly more distant, you can actually apply a bit more humour. A bit more humour to it. I know she's a dear friend of yours. I am going to mention her name. There was a certain quote that I asked Ailsa to read because she had the most convincing accent for what I needed read out. And I can still hear her reading it now. It was just an absolute joy and a gift hearing her recite the words of a 14th century chronicler to everybody else that was listening on the Zoom call. It was magnificent. But again, knowing other people have experienced this, knowing other people have put words on paper or vellum or whatever to this, can be a way in to your own writing. And I think my hope would be, from everything that comes subsequent to this, is that more people will write, because sometimes the joy of research and looking into the past is what someone's written. So you go, I'm reading that and I'm with them there now. And in 200 years, people will be looking at 2020 and thinking the world history occurred during that year. And it doesn't matter what you wrote during that year, it is relevant because you were enduring that year. And 2021's obviously becoming the same, Matt, because we're in a lovely position now. But, the news from India is coming in every day. The news from Brazil is coming in every day. And this isn't over by a long shot. The world.
Hearing you talk there, I'm just getting a really vivid image of your plumb line to the now. There's this sort of line going into our history, but a really embedded history in the locale.
Yeah.
Have you come across anybody else through this process who's doing something similar elsewhere? Is anybody else looking at their own?
That's really interesting, and no, Matt, I haven't. If they had, it's not jumping out of my head. But again, I think that would be really valuable to actually have a look at and see what else people are doing in order to capture what's happening now in this place.
Because we all had such an intense experience of our own locale in that first lockdown, didn't we?
Yep.
And yet, all the time we're being taken back to this is a global thing. We're all there's something in that local to that global, which we need to hold on to. Because the local solutions are going to have to be one of the ways through this. Just as you said with New Zealand, the idea of we're going to have to do for ourselves for a while in order to get through this, and I think that came home really clearly to people, didn't it?
No, I completely agree. Is that and it's been an absolute reality of the first time I've lived through world history. Is that history is happening all around us, huge events are happening all around us, and yet we're all there. I really need toilet paper, and I can't find a shop in Dumfries that's selling any toilet paper. And I had a friend that had a ticket for a cash and carry that very generously actually got me 32 bits from the cash and carry and dropped it off outside my front door without coming into the house. And so you're still shopping, you're still cooking, you've still got children at school, you've got elderly relatives. All of this absolute, mundane aspect of human life has to carry on, and everyone has to manage that, cope with that, and still being bombarded with images and text and newspapers of really significant world events happening. And so we walk this dichotomy of I'm living in Pempunt, and Pempunt is my pandemic, and yet the pandemic is 360 degrees all around this globe. So we've all carried that absolute fundamental split in our personalities and intentions, and there is something truly fascinating about that.
So all this amazing visual, written, everything, oaks, doors, plague masks. I mean, how are you pulling it together to communicate it to other people from here then?
Well, I'm delighted to say that obviously there will be a poetry book at some point, and a poetry film at some point. But what's really for me really, really great, and I mean genuinely great, is we're going to have an exhibition at Dumfries Museum from June through to September on reflections on the pandemic, incorporating, hopefully a lot of what I've done. And what I've asked other artists to do. So there's a glorious embroiderer who is currently embroidering the waves of cholera, the Asian cholera pandemic, onto a world map, a few streets away from me. Yes, exhibition at Dumfries Museum, and although social distancing guidelines will be in place, bringing a lot of the research I've done to the most important community, which is my local community, I think will be an absolute joy. And then Obviously, I want to get my book out. I want to do lots of readings, and really hoping that as part of the museum aspect that I'm going to do some, public online talks, and that would be really, really lovely as well, that people can connect into. And no one can predict where this pandemic is going, but wouldn't it be nice if in September, October we can do in-person events and I can actually stand in front of people and gesticulate wildly at them about plague, cholera and Spanish flu. And ask them to go, because one of the most moving things, Matt, was the Donald Ray story. And because how do you process 3 million deaths we've got at the moment in the world with Spanish flu? They were looking at as many as 50 million possibly. How do you process that amount of death? You cannot. And so when I read the story of Donald Ray, an Australian soldier that died of influenza in Dumfries infirmary in 1919, all of a sudden his whole story, which encapsulates World War I and death from pandemic disease, becomes utterly real through one man and one man's tragedy. And that grave is sitting in Dumfries High Cemetery, and you go and visit it, and there is a world of history in one slab of stone. And I think for me, that's what Atlas Pandemica is. This whole region, you can walk anywhere, you can walk in any graveyard, and you will find someone that's died too soon from a pandemic disease. And if that, and it touches more than the heart, it touches the soul, and it's the soul of the region, and it's the soul of every town and city. And we should remember that, and it's going to happen.
That idea of communicating through time like that, I was that story of Donald Ray, I was so touched by the idea of his father in Australia having, what was it, 8 words or something?
They're allowed 137 characters for the actual gravestone. And hang on, I'll get this right through memory. And his father from Australia in 1918 came up with the words and poetry: through fire, wounds, prison, came safely, then gazing homeward died.
Amazing.
And that makes,
But to be communicating that across the other side of the world to put on a stone in a place presumably he'd never been to, maybe would never go to. Extraordinary, just extraordinary. I mean, it's something that I've asked a lot of the artists in this, but this for you, that process of open-ended inquiry of like you just launched into this and you didn't know where it was going to go, what was going to come out from it. Is that different to how you normally work, and what did you get from that, or how did it affect the outcome?
I don't think it's different to how I normally work, Matt, in that I am the ubiquitous open-ended inquirer. But it's, whether it was homegrown initially, or just the fact that the stove facilitates things in such a beautiful manner, and particularly, this is really important, the fact that we were, 10 artists in a group working together, and I know we only got to meet, once in person and then met on Zoom, but hearing other people talk about their process and what they were doing made me feel part of a unit that was experimenting. And I obviously, somehow took that in and thought, what, I have got freedom to experiment here and make things differently to the way I have made things before. And so there was something intrinsic to the way Atlas Pandemica was created, written and curated that enabled me to take the steps that I have taken. So open-ended inquiry, no, I am the utmost open-ended inquiry, because you start something and I never know where it's going, and until I have got my words written on a page. I could start writing something and I don't know where it's going to end up, and that's the honest truth. However, the open-ended process and approach, I think, is been particularly intrinsic to how I've approached Atlas Pandemica because of the nature of Atlas Pandemica.
Yeah, and I mean, there's, I'm just taking us back to where one of the bits you started with was about the cholera memorial in St Michael's Kirkyard in Dumfries. I mean, and there's obviously talk already about COVID memorials, and you're kind of like thinking, oh well, yeah. I mean, could you see that as one of the outcomes of where Atlas Pandemica?
I think that's such a difficult one, Matt, because my gut is we're not ready. The world's not ready to memorialise COVID yet because we are not over it. Cholera was like the hardest hit. You know, it came in September, it's gone by November. And although we had a resurgence in 1848, it was a real bang, devastating death toll for Dumfries, and then it was gone. Whereas, you know, we've been enduring this now for 15 months or so, and we are nowhere near the end of it. So I don't feel, I'm certainly not ready to make it to make any memorial or that anyone should have any thoughts of a memorial. But as we said, with the paper creation and generating things which are intrinsically this time, you know, I think creating the record is vital. But I don't think we're ready for memorial yet. I really don't. I really don't.
No, I entirely agree. I think these things, you need the space to reflect, and we're still in the middle, and you're in the middle. JoAnne, that's been amazing. Thank you. I just love talking to you because you just like you just zoom in and out along that plumb line, and there's so many things I want to follow up now, having looked at that and seeing your work, and then going around the places that I know so well and seeing them. It's such a gift. So thank you. And thank you for the chat. It's been great. So for people listening, you can find more about JoAnne's work and all the Atlas Pandemica artists, including the rest of the podcast series at atlaspandemica.org. And please tune in again next week for our next podcast, which will be with another writer on the project, Karen Campbell. So, hey, thank you, JoAnne.
Thank you, Matt. It's been an absolute pleasure, and Pandemica itself has been a pleasure to process what we're living through. Thanks.
Cheers.